My golden child brother got everything. Ivy League tuition paid in full, a BMW at 17, a corner office he never earned, and I got the leftovers of our parents' love, the scraps of attention after they'd fed him a feast. For 28 years I watched the injustice, swallowed the humiliation, built my life in the shadows of his spotlight, telling myself that dignity meant rising above it, that revenge was beneath me. But here's the secret nobody tells you about family betrayal. Sometimes the truth doesn't set you free. It detonates everything you thought you knew, and leaves you standing in the rubble wondering who these people really are. What happened next at that summer barbecue wasn't just sibling drama or typical family dysfunction. It was the kind of shocking exposure that proves some people will lie, cheat, steal, and destroy anyone who threatens their carefully constructed image. I couldn't believe what my own brother was capable of, couldn't fathom how deep the infidelity to basic decency actually went, until a beer bottle came flying at my face, and an 84-year-old man started laughing like he'd been waiting decades to watch this empire of lies finally crumble. The truth about golden children? They're not golden. They're just painted that way by parents too afraid to let the paint chip off. And when it finally does, when karma comes collecting with receipts and witnesses and evidence that can't be explained away, the whole family learns that unconditional love without accountability isn't love at all. It's just conspiracy with better marketing. The amber glass exploded inches from my face, beer foam dripping down my cheek like some twisted baptism I never asked for. 1 second I'm standing by the grill, casually mentioning I'd just closed on my third rental property, and the next, crash, my brother Derek's hurling a bottle at me like I'd just confessed to murder. The entire backyard froze, burgers suspended mid-flip, cousins with forks halfway to their mouths, everyone staring at the shattered glass glittering on the patio stones. I couldn't believe what just happened, couldn't process the rage twisting Derek's face into something unrecognizable. Then Grandpa Joe, 84 years old, seen every family drama since the Depression, started laughing. This low, knowing chuckle that made my blood run cold. Derek had always been the golden child, the one who could do no wrong in our parents' eyes, the kid who got Harvard tuition while I scraped together community college loans. Every family gathering was a stage for his achievements, his promotions, his perfectly curated life that looked like a magazine spread, but felt hollow up close. There was always something frantic in how my parents protected him, like they were trying to make up for a secret I didn't understand yet. I'd learned to stay quiet, to celebrate my wins privately, because any mention of my success triggered something dark in him. Pure jealousy wrapped in entitlement. Backstab doesn't even begin to describe how it felt growing up in his shadow, watching Mom and Dad pour resources into his dreams while mine got a polite nod. But this? Violence? Over real estate? The betrayal of that moment cut deeper than any childhood slight ever could. Grandpa Joe wiped tears from his eyes, still chuckling, and said something that made the whole yard go even quieter, if that was possible. "Boy's got a secret that'll bring this whole family to its knees," he announced, voice carrying that authority only 8 decades of living can give you. Derek's face went from red to white in seconds, and I watched him try to laugh it off, try to redirect, but his hands were shaking. The truth was crawling out of whatever dark corner he'd buried it in, and everyone could sense it. Something was about to get exposed, something shocking that explained years of entitled behavior and explosive reactions whenever anyone else dared to succeed. I stood there with beer still dripping from my hair, and instead of crying or running inside like the old version of me might have done, I felt this strange calm settle over my shoulders. This was the moment everything would change. I could feel it like electricity before a storm, that crackling tension when lightning's about to strike. Derek started backing toward the house, muttering about me being dramatic, about how I always made everything about myself. Classic manipulation tactics I'd seen him use 1,000 times. But Grandpa Joe wasn't done. Wasn't letting him escape this time. Whatever he knew, whatever he'd been holding on to, was about to detonate our family's carefully constructed facade. Mom grabbed Dad's arm, her knuckles white, and I saw something flicker across her face that looked almost like guilt. Or maybe recognition, like she'd been waiting for this shoe to drop for years. Derek's wife gathered their kids and hustled them inside, and the relatives started finding excuses to check their phones, study the fence, Anything to avoid the confrontation building like a tidal wave. Revenge wasn't even on my mind yet. I was still processing the violence, the hatred in my brother's eyes over something as simple as me building wealth through hard work. But Grandpa Joe caught my eye and gave me this tiny nod, and I understood. He was about to give me the justice I'd been denied my entire life. The real story of Derek's perfect life was about to unravel, thread by thread, and I had no idea how deep the lies actually went. Growing up, I learned early that love in our family came with conditions, and Derek met every single one of them while I couldn't even get on the scoreboard. He got accepted to Harvard, champagne toasts, family photo shoot, Dad crying with pride. While I got into State University, and Mom said, "That's nice, honey," without looking up from her phone. The inequality wasn't subtle. It was a neon sign flashing "golden child" over his head and afterthought over mine, and everyone pretended not to see it. I watched them hand him a BMW on his 17th birthday, cherry red with a bow, while I drove a 15-year-old Honda Civic I'd bought myself from 3 part-time jobs. The humiliation of standing next to his car at family events, fielding questions about when I'd get something nice, carved out a space in my chest that ached for years. Derek walked straight from graduation into an executive position at Dad's commercial real estate firm. No applications, no interviews, just a corner office and a salary that made my eyes water when I accidentally saw a pay stub. Meanwhile, I was grinding through night classes for my real estate license, working as a property manager during the day, building my knowledge brick by brick with no shortcuts or family connections. The family drama around every holiday was Derek talking about his deals, his team, his vision for expanding the business, while I sat silent knowing any mention of my achievements would get labeled as making it about yourself. Cheated doesn't even capture it. I was playing a completely different game with different rules, where his mediocre effort got celebrated and my excellence got ignored. But I kept going, kept saving, kept learning, because I refused to let their favoritism define my worth or my future. By the time I was 32, I'd built something real. 3 rental properties, all cash flowing, all purchased through my own strategic planning and financial discipline that nobody taught me. Derek was 35, still living in the executive role Dad had gift-wrapped for him, still driving company cars and taking business trips that looked suspiciously like vacations. The contrast should have been obvious to anyone paying attention. I was building actual wealth while he was spending a salary he hadn't really earned. But our parents only had eyes for their golden boy. Every family gathering became this performance where they'd ask him about his projects at the firm, while my real estate portfolio got a distracted, "Oh, that's good," before changing the subject. The betrayal wasn't just in the unequal treatment anymore. It was in their refusal to even acknowledge reality, to see what we'd each actually accomplished. I started noticing things, though. Little cracks in Derek's perfect facade that didn't quite add up if you were actually paying attention. He'd get defensive when Dad asked detailed questions about specific deals, would redirect conversations away from numbers and toward vision and strategy in ways that felt rehearsed. His wife would give him these looks sometimes, worried glances that suggested she knew something wasn't right, but was too scared or complicit to say anything. The company's growth had slowed over the past 3 years despite Derek's supposed brilliance, and I'd hear Dad on the phone sometimes, voice tight with stress, talking about cash flow issues that didn't make sense. But nobody wanted to question the golden child. Nobody wanted to admit that maybe Harvard and a BMW didn't actually equal competence or integrity. The Saturday before the barbecue explosion, I'd run into one of Dad's longtime employees at a coffee shop, and she'd said something that stuck with me like a splinter. "Your brother's got expensive taste for someone whose salary we all know," she'd mentioned casually, then looked like she regretted it, quickly changing the subject to the weather. I couldn't believe she'd said it out loud, but it confirmed suspicions I'd been pushing down for years. Where was Derek's money actually coming from? His house was too big, his cars too new, his lifestyle too lavish for even his inflated executive salary to support. Dignity demanded I not spread rumors or accusations, so I stayed quiet. But my mind was churning through possibilities that made my stomach hurt. The truth was circling closer, like a shark in dark water, and I had no idea how soon it would break the surface. Grandpa Joe reached into his jacket pocket, slowly, deliberately, like a prosecutor presenting evidence to a jury, and pulled out a manila envelope so thick it could have been a novel. "I've been watching the books for 60 years, he said, voice steady as iron, eyes locked on Derek, who'd gone pale as a ghost. "Started noticing irregularities about 3 years back, little things that didn't sit right with this old brain. So I did what any man with sense would do. I hired someone to dig." The envelope hit the patio table with a thud that felt like a gavel striking, and I watched Derek's whole body go rigid, fight-or-flight instincts warring across his face. My parents stood frozen. Dad's hand halfway to the envelope like he wanted to grab it, but couldn't quite make himself move. And I realized with sickening clarity that this was bigger than sibling rivalry or family drama. Grandpa Joe spread the papers across the table like he was dealing cards in the world's worst poker game. And suddenly we were looking at bank statements, invoices, checks made out to vendors I'd never heard of in my life. $347,000, he announced, and the number hung in the air like smoke from a gun that had just been fired. Embezzled over 36 months through fake invoices, phantom contractors, and checks written to shell companies that don't exist outside of Derek's little criminal enterprise. I couldn't believe the numbers I was seeing. The systematic theft laid out in black and white. Proof of betrayal that went so far beyond favoritism it entered criminal territory. Derek had taken his parents' trust, his position of privilege, and weaponized it to steal from the family business while everyone celebrated him as their golden child. The yard erupted like someone had thrown a grenade into a wedding reception. Dad lunging for the papers, Mom gasping and clutching her chest, aunts and uncles backing away like Derek might be contagious with whatever moral rot had led him here. Derek found his voice finally, started yelling about lies and confusion and mistakes. How these were legitimate expenses that Grandpa just didn't understand because he was old and out of touch. But Grandpa Joe had receipts, literally, and he pulled out more documents showing how Derek had created fake vendor accounts, forged signatures, even made up entire construction projects that never happened. The revenge I'd wanted for years of inequality suddenly felt too small compared to this systematic fraud that had probably kept me out of the family business, not because I wasn't good enough, but because Derek couldn't risk me seeing the books. Derek switched tactics mid-meltdown, pointing at me with a shaking finger, voice cracking with desperation as he tried to shift the narrative. "She's behind this," he shouted. And I actually laughed because the accusation was so absurd, so perfectly on brand for someone caught red-handed. She's always been jealous, always resented me, and now she's turned Grandpa against me with lies because she can't stand that I'm successful. The gaslighting was masterful. I had to give him that, trying to paint me as the villain when he was the one who'd been stealing. But Grandpa Joe didn't even blink, just pulled out another document showing Derek's signature on a check made out to JM Construction Services for $80,000 for a renovation project that never existed. The shocking part wasn't even the money anymore. It was watching someone I'd known my whole life reveal themselves as a complete stranger. A con artist who'd lived among us for years. Dad finally found his voice, and it came out broken. Aged 10 years in 10 minutes. "Derek, tell me this isn't true," he begged. And I heard 35 years of investment crumbling in those 6 words. Derek's wife had reappeared at the back door, and the look on her face told me she'd known, maybe not everything, but enough, and had stayed silent, complicit in the lie. The family betrayal multiplied in that moment, spreading like cracks in glass, because this wasn't just one person's crime, but a web of secrets and silence that had let it continue. Karma had finally arrived at our doorstep, dressed in manila folders and bank statements, and it was demanding payment with interest. Derek opened his mouth to respond to Dad, and I saw a calculation flash across his face, the wheels turning as he planned his next move. And I knew. I just knew. This wasn't over yet. 3 days passed in eerie silence. No family group chat messages, no calls, nothing but the sound of a bomb ticking somewhere in the darkness waiting to explode again. Then Derek sent a text to everyone. "Family meeting. My house. Saturday 2 p.m. I have proof that will clear my name and expose the real thief." My stomach dropped reading those words. Not because I thought he actually had anything on me, but because I recognized the tone. Cornered animals bite hardest, and Derek had always been a master manipulator when his back was against the wall. Mom called me crying, begging me to come, saying we needed to hear him out. and give him a chance to defend himself. And I realized she was still protecting him even with evidence of his crimes spread across Grandpa Joe's table. The betrayal of that phone call hurt almost as much as the original theft. Knowing she'd choose his lies over the truth if it meant keeping her golden child's image intact. I showed up early, deliberately, because I wanted to see what Derek was setting up before the performance began. His house looked like something from a crime documentary. Papers everywhere, laptop open to spreadsheets, a projector set up in the living room like he was about to give a corporate presentation. He barely looked at me when I walked in, just gestured to a chair with this cold confidence that made my skin crawl, like he'd already won a game I didn't know we were playing. "Glad you could make it," he said, voice dripping with false civility, and I saw it then. The trap he'd been building while we all thought he was panicking. This wasn't going to be a confession or an apology. This was going to be character assassination. An attempt to burn me down to save himself. Vengeance was rising in my throat, but I swallowed it, stayed calm, because showing emotion now would only feed into whatever narrative he'd constructed. The family filed in. Mom and Dad, Grandpa Joe, Derek's wife hovering in the background looking like she wanted to disappear into the wallpaper. A few aunts and uncles who couldn't resist the drama. Derek waited until everyone was seated, then dimmed the lights like we were about to watch a TED Talk instead of a desperate man's last stand. "I've spent the last 72 hours investigating," he began, voice steady and rehearsed. "And what I found shocked me to my core." He clicked to the first slide, and there it was. My name in bold letters at the top of a document that looked official, professional, damning. My heart started racing not from guilt, but from pure rage at the audacity, the calculated cruelty of trying to frame me for his crimes. I couldn't believe he'd go this far, but watching him present forged bank transfers supposedly from my accounts, I realized there was no bottom to how low the golden child would sink. Derek had created an entire alternate reality where I was the criminal mastermind. Documents showing transfers from the business account to accounts he claimed were mine. Invoices he said I'd created using insider knowledge from overheard conversations at family dinners. Even a timeline suggesting I'd planned this for years out of jealousy and resentment. The performance was flawless, I had to admit. His voice never wavered. His eye contact was perfect. He even managed to look hurt and betrayed as he reluctantly exposed his own sister. Some of the relatives were nodding along, wanting to believe him, because the alternative meant their golden child was a fraud and a felon. Dad looked torn, physically torn between the son he'd invested everything in and the evidence that kept piling up against that investment. The infidelity to truth, to basic decency, to family itself. It was breathtaking in its scope and shamelessness. Then Derek played his final card, the one designed to bury me completely, and possibly send me to prison in his place. "I've already contacted the authorities," he announced, and my blood went ice cold. "I have a meeting scheduled with a detective Monday morning to present all of this evidence and file charges for embezzlement and fraud." He looked directly at me, and I saw something in his eyes that went beyond desperation. It was hatred, pure toxic rage at anyone who threatened to expose him. This wasn't just about covering his crimes anymore. This was about destroying me, humiliating me, taking me down so completely that even if the truth came out eventually, I'd be ruined first. Grandpa Joe stood up slowly, hands shaking not from age but from fury, and said 4 words that changed everything. "I hired someone too." The woman who walked through Derek's front door 2 minutes later looked like she'd stepped out of a forensic accounting textbook. Sharp suit, briefcase, and an expression that said she'd seen every trick in the book and invented countermeasures for most of them. "Lisa Chen, certified forensic accountant and digital forensics specialist," she introduced herself, setting her laptop on the dining table like a surgeon laying out instruments. Grandpa Joe had called her the night of the barbecue explosion, given her 72 hours to examine every document Derek had presented, and the smile on her face told me she'd found exactly what we needed. Derek's confidence cracked visibly, color draining from his face as he realized his carefully constructed frame-up was about to get demolished by someone who actually knew what they were doing. The truth was walking through his door with evidence and expertise, and there was nowhere left for him to hide. Lisa connected her laptop to Derek's projector. The ultimate power move, using his own equipment against him, and pulled up her first slide with the clinical precision of someone presenting to a jury. "Let's start with document metadata," she began, and I watched Derek's wife quietly slip her phone out, probably texting a lawyer. Every digital document contains hidden information about when it was created, modified, who created it, and from what device. She pulled up one of Derek's evidence documents, the one supposedly showing transfers from my account, and zoomed in on properties I didn't even know existed. This document was created 4 days ago at 2:47 a.m. using Adobe Acrobat Pro on a device registered to Derek Mitchell, with 17 separate modifications over the following 48 hours. The shocking simplicity of it. He'd literally forged everything in the last week, and the computer had kept receipts the whole time. But Lisa wasn't done, wasn't even close to done. And with each slide, I watched my brother's entire conspiracy collapse like a house of cards in a hurricane. She showed how the font in the official bank documents didn't match actual bank fonts, how the spacing was wrong, how he'd used templates available online for creating fake financial statements. "These account numbers," she pointed to the ones Derek claimed were mine, "don't exist in any banking system I can access, which means they're fabricated." She pulled up real bank records, my actual accounts, subpoenaed with my permission, showing zero connection to the business or any suspicious transfers. Payback arrived in PowerPoint format, each slide another nail in Derek's coffin. Proof that his entire presentation was built on lies and desperation. I couldn't believe the depth of planning he'd put into trying to frame me, the hours spent forging documents that fell apart under 5 minutes of expert scrutiny. Then Lisa dropped the bomb that made even Mom gasp. Derek hadn't just forged documents in the last week. He'd been planning this frame-up for months, maybe longer. "I found drafts of these exact documents on a hard drive, Mr. Mitchell thought he'd deleted, dating back 7 months," she explained, pulling up files with dates that made my stomach turn. He'd started building his scapegoat strategy before Grandpa Joe had even confronted him, probably as insurance in case he ever got caught. She showed chat logs with a private investigator Derek had hired, messages discussing how to build a case against me, how to make it look convincing, what evidence would hold up in court. The betrayal went so deep I couldn't process it. My own brother had spent months plotting to send me to prison for crimes he'd committed, had researched and strategized my destruction with the same focus most people put into career planning. Lisa's final slides showed the real money trail, the one Derek had tried so hard to obscure. Shell companies registered to addresses that didn't exist, transfers that pinged through 3 banks before landing in accounts under his wife's maiden name, cash withdrawals that coincided with major purchases he'd made. "The total I can prove is $412,000 over 3.5 years, she stated. Grandpa's estimate had been conservative. Lisa's audit uncovered transactions even he hadn't seen. And this, she pulled up one more document, is a signed affidavit from the private investigator Mr. Mitchell hired, who became concerned about the legality of what he was being asked to do and decided to cooperate with my investigation." Derek stood frozen, mouth opening and closing like a fish drowning in air, and I saw the exact moment he realized it was over. Truly, completely, irreversibly over. Justice wasn't just knocking. It had kicked down the door with evidence, testimony, and digital fingerprints he couldn't erase. What made this possible wasn't that the evidence didn't exist. It was that everyone was holding their peace in silence, afraid to be the one who shattered the illusion. Grandpa had his suspicions and documents. Lisa had her expertise. The PI had his conscience. I had my observations. And our parents. They had their recording. All these fragments existed separately, waiting for someone brave enough to start pulling the thread. Derek collapsed into a chair like someone had cut his strings, and for the first time in 3 days the mask completely shattered. Not the confident executive, not the wronged brother, just a broken man whose entire world had imploded in a PowerPoint presentation. "You want to know why?" he whispered, voice cracked and raw, and suddenly everyone leaned forward, because even in destruction people crave narrative, crave meaning. "I found out when I was 16 that I was adopted," he said, and the room went silent in a different way. The kind of quiet that comes when the villain suddenly becomes human. Mom made a choking sound. Dad's face went gray, and I felt my anger stumble over itself because this wasn't in the script. This was supposed to be simple revenge, simple justice, not complicated family trauma bleeding out in front of everyone. The truth always has layers, apparently, even when you think you've reached the bottom. I was looking for my birth certificate for a school trip and found adoption papers in Dad's file cabinet. Derek continued, tears streaming down his face now, all pretense gone. I was 16 years old and discovered my entire identity was a lie, that the parents I'd loved my whole life had kept this massive secret from me. He looked at our parents, his parents, and I saw decades of resentment and insecurity pouring out in that gaze. I confronted them that night, and they begged me not to tell anyone, said it would complicate things, said they loved me just the same, but please keep it quiet. The betrayal he'd felt echoed in his voice, and I realized with uncomfortable clarity that his behavior, his need to be the golden child, his desperation to prove his worth, it all stemmed from a wound that had been festering for 19 years. Karma has a twisted sense of irony, making me understand my enemy right when I wanted to hate him most completely. But Grandpa Joe wasn't satisfied with that explanation, wasn't letting Derek use childhood trauma as a blanket excuse for adult crimes. "Tell them the rest," he demanded, voice hard as concrete, and Derek flinched like he'd been struck. "Tell them what your parents did after you found out." Derek's wife stepped forward then, and I saw guilt written all over her face too. She'd known everything, had been complicit, not just in the stealing, but in this deeper family dysfunction. "They started overcompensating," she said quietly, and Mom started crying for real now. The BMW, Harvard, the executive position, it was all guilt money, guilt opportunities, their way of proving they loved him, even though he wasn't biologically theirs. The shocking revelation wasn't just the adoption anymore. It was that our parents had known Derek knew, had responded by making him untouchable, and in doing so had created a monster who believed he deserved everything and owed nothing. Grandpa Joe pulled out another document. How many did this man have? And this one was a letter, yellowed with age, dated 19 years ago. "Your mother wrote this to me after Derek found out," he explained, reading aloud words that made my skin crawl. "We're terrified he'll feel less loved, less part of the family. So we've decided to make absolutely sure he knows he's our priority, our focus, our golden boy who can do no wrong." The words hung there like evidence at a trial. Proof that my childhood of being overlooked wasn't accidental or even unconscious favoritism. It was deliberate strategy, calculated sacrifice of one child's needs to overcompensate for another's insecurity. I couldn't believe my parents had actively chosen this path, had decided that the solution to Derek's pain was to create mine, to make me invisible so he could feel seen. The infidelity to basic fairness, to loving both your children equally, cut deeper than any of Derek's financial crimes ever could. Derek looked at me then, really looked at me, and I saw something that might have been remorse, or might just have been exhaustion. "I resented you," he admitted, voice barely above a whisper. "You were the real daughter, the one who shared their blood, and everything came so easy to you. The intelligence, the work ethic, the ability to build something from nothing." The irony of his words would have been funny if they weren't so tragic. He thought I had it easy while I'd spent 32 years feeling like a ghost in my own family. Every time you succeeded, it felt like proof that I didn't really belong, that they'd made a mistake choosing me, that blood actually did matter more than love. His pain was real. I could see that now, but so was mine. And somewhere in this wreckage of a family, we'd all been cheated out of the truth, lied to in different ways that had poisoned everything. But understanding his wound didn't erase his crimes, didn't undo the embezzlement or the attempted frame-up. And as Grandpa Joe's hand landed on my shoulder, I knew we hadn't reached the final twist yet. Mom's purse was sitting on the side table, and with shaking hands she reached inside and pulled out something that made my blood freeze. A small digital voice recorder, the kind people use for interviews or lectures. "We need to tell them," she said to Dad, who looked like he wanted to disappear into the floorboards. And I knew whatever was coming would somehow be worse than everything we'd already heard. She pressed play, and Derek's voice filled the room. Not from now, but from weeks ago, crystal clear and absolutely damning. "I've got the fake documents ready. Got the story straight, and once I present them, everyone will believe she's the thief," he said on the recording, talking to someone whose responses were muffled. The betrayal multiplied exponentially. My parents had known, had physical evidence of his plan to frame me, and had said nothing, done nothing, just watched as he built his trap. The recording continued, and I listened to my brother discuss strategy like he was planning a marketing campaign instead of a felony. "The key is making it look like jealousy drove her to it, like she couldn't stand that I got everything and she got nothing," recorded Derek explained, his voice cold and calculated. "Everyone already believes that narrative anyway, so I'm just confirming what they want to think." I couldn't believe I was hearing this. Couldn't process that my parents had listened to their son plot to send their daughter to prison, and their response was to record it and stay silent. Mom was sobbing now, mascara running down her face in black rivers, but I felt nothing for her tears, because she'd had weeks to warn me, weeks to stop this, and she'd chosen protection of the golden child over basic human decency. The shocking part wasn't even Derek's cruelty anymore. It was our parents' complicity, their willingness to sacrifice me to save him. We didn't know what to do. Dad finally spoke, and his voice sounded ancient, hollowed out by shame. "We thought if we confronted him, he'd just get better at hiding it. Thought maybe we could convince him to confess on his own. Thought..." He broke off, and Grandpa Joe made a sound of pure disgust. "You thought you could manage it, control it, make it go away without consequences," Grandpa finished for him. "You thought you could protect him from his own crimes and somehow nobody would get hurt." Mom's voice cracked as she tried to explain. I kept telling myself I was buying time, that recording him was protection. But the truth was uglier. I was still choosing Derek over you. The family drama had transcended simple favoritism and entered pathological territory. They'd literally chosen potential witness to a crime over warning the intended victim. Revenge felt too small a word for what I wanted in that moment. I wanted them to feel every ounce of terror I would have felt if Derek's plan had worked. If I'd been arrested, charged, destroyed by lies they could have prevented. Lisa Chen stood up, and her expression had shifted from professional to personally offended. "You understand that recording him without warning your daughter potentially makes you accessories after the fact?" she said. And I watched my parents' faces register true fear for the first time. At minimum, it's obstruction, possibly conspiracy depending on how a prosecutor wants to play it. The recording was still playing in the background, Derek discussing timelines, talking about how he'd time the reveal for maximum impact, mentioning how he'd already researched which prison I'd likely go to. Mom had turned off her phone's sound but kept recording, kept collecting evidence while her son plotted her daughter's destruction, and the cognitive dissonance of that choice broke something fundamental in how I understood my family. They weren't just flawed or misguided. They were actively, consciously complicit in a crime against their own child. Grandpa Joe took the recorder from Mom's trembling hands and added it to his growing pile of evidence. "This is what happens when you love without accountability," he said, looking at his daughter and son-in-law with something between pity and contempt. "You enabled a thief, then enabled a conspiracy, and called it parenting." The dignity I'd fought so hard to maintain was cracking around the edges. I wanted to scream, to throw things, to make them feel even a fraction of the humiliation and fear their silence had created. But Derek's wife was whispering something to him urgently, and he was nodding, and I saw a new kind of panic flash across his face, the kind that comes when you realize your last card is worthless. "There's something else," she said to the room, voice barely audible, and I thought I couldn't possibly handle another revelation, another layer of betrayal. But karma wasn't done with us yet. Derek stood abruptly, knocking his chair backwards, and stumbled toward the kitchen with this wild look in his eyes that made everyone freeze. "I can't do this anymore," he shouted, voice cracking with theatrical desperation that somehow felt both genuine and performed at the same time. "You've all destroyed me, exposed me, humiliated me in front of everyone. There's nothing left." He was grabbing at cabinets, pulling drawers open with shaking hands, and his wife screamed, "Derek, no!" in a way that felt rehearsed, like they'd discussed this possibility. My heart was pounding, not from concern, but from rage. Was he really about to weaponize suicide as his final manipulation? His last attempt to make himself the victim instead of the villain? The betrayal of using mental health crisis as a shield when you're a caught criminal felt like a new low, even for him. He emerged from the kitchen clutching a prescription bottle, and I watched him dump what looked like 20 pills into his palm with trembling fingers. "This is what you all wanted, right?" he said. Tears and snot running down his face in a display of broken humanity that would have worked on me years ago. The golden child finally crashes, finally pays, finally disappears so everyone can move on without the embarrassment. Mom lunged for him. Dad was yelling. Aunts were crying. And the whole scene devolved into chaos exactly the way Derek needed it to. Attention fully on him. Sympathy rising despite everything. The potential tragedy overshadowing the actual crimes. I couldn't believe we were here. Couldn't believe he'd escalate to this level of manipulation. But then, I caught Grandpa Joe's eye and saw he wasn't moving, wasn't panicking, was just watching with this strange calm that didn't match the moment. Derek raised his hand to his mouth, pills visible between his fingers. And in that split second, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The pills were wrong. I'd spent enough time managing properties and dealing with tenant emergencies to recognize medications, and those weren't antidepressants or painkillers or anything dangerous. They were too bright, too uniform, the wrong shape entirely for what he was claiming. "Stop!" I shouted, and my voice cut through the chaos like a blade. "Those aren't prescription pills." Everyone froze, Derek's hand hovering near his mouth, and I saw panic flash across his face. Not the panic of someone interrupted mid-suicide, but the panic of someone whose bluff just got called. The shocking audacity of faking a suicide attempt as your final play when you've already been exposed for embezzlement and conspiracy. It was almost impressive in its shamelessness. I walked over calmly, grabbed the bottle from the counter where he'd set it, and read the label out loud. Men's Daily Multivitamin. Take 1 per day with food. The silence that followed was somehow worse than all the screaming. It was the sound of Derek's last shred of credibility evaporating. The final mask shattering to reveal absolutely nothing underneath but manipulation and desperation. He tried to maintain the act for about 5 seconds, then just deflated like a punctured balloon, pills spilling from his hand onto the floor where they bounced and scattered like evidence of his complete moral bankruptcy. I thought if you all saw how much pain I was in," he started. But nobody was listening anymore because we'd all finally, truly seen him for exactly what he was. Not a wounded adopted child, not a victim of circumstances, just a man who'd steal, lie, frame, and fake suicide to avoid consequences. Lisa Chen was already on her phone, presumably calling the authorities because attempted manipulation of a suicide crisis to avoid prosecution probably violated several laws I didn't even know existed. Derek sank to the floor, surrounded by vitamin pills and the wreckage of every bridge he'd ever had, and I felt nothing. Not satisfaction, not revenge, not even anger anymore. Just exhaustion and a strange clarity about what came next. Mom tried to go to him, but Grandpa Joe caught her arm and said quietly, "No more. No more protecting. No more excusing. No more enabling. This ends now." The vengeance I'd wanted turned out to be watching my brother destroy himself completely through his own choices, while everyone finally saw the truth. Justice wasn't me defeating him. It was him defeating himself while we all watched with evidence, witnesses, and a voice recorder that captured every calculated word. The police arrived 18 minutes later, and I watched 2 officers walk Derek out of his own house in handcuffs, while neighbors peered through windows and recorded on phones. He didn't fight, didn't protest, just walked with his head down, like a man who'd finally run out of moves, run out of lies, run out of people willing to believe him. The charges were extensive: embezzlement, fraud, conspiracy to commit fraud, filing false reports, witness intimidation. And Lisa Chen had prepared such an airtight case that the prosecutor called it gift-wrapped. Over the next 3 months, as Derek sat in county jail unable to make the $500,000 bail, I watched our family business get audited, restructured, and slowly rebuilt from the foundation he'd nearly destroyed. The shocking part was how much damage one person's entitlement and our parents' enablement had caused. Vendors unpaid, contracts breached, employees' retirement funds nearly depleted because Derek had been treating the company like his personal ATM for years. The trial lasted 2 weeks, And I sat in that courtroom every single day watching justice grind forward with the slow inevitability of a glacier. Derek's lawyer tried every defense: troubled childhood, adoption trauma, mental health crisis, family pressure. But the evidence was overwhelming, and the fake suicide attempt had poisoned any sympathy the jury might have had. When the verdict came back guilty on all counts, I didn't feel the triumphant revenge I'd imagined in my darker moments. I felt sad, hollowed out, grieving for the family we could have been if anyone had chosen truth over image. The judge sentenced him to 8 years in federal prison, plus full restitution of $412,000. And as they led him away, he looked at me one last time, with something that might have been regret, or might have been resentment. I couldn't tell anymore, and realized I didn't care. Payback had arrived, but it felt less like victory, and more like everyone had lost something they'd never get back. My parents entered therapy, both individual and couples, and for the first time in my life, I watched them actually confront their role in creating the family dynamics that had led here. Mom wrote me a letter, 12 pages of apologies and explanations that boiled down to, we thought love meant never saying no, never setting boundaries, never letting our golden child face consequences. Dad sold his stake in the business to me and Grandpa Joe, couldn't stomach running a company his son had robbed, and the guilt aged him 10 years and 10 months. We established new rules: radical honesty, accountability over image, equal treatment or no treatment, and slowly, painfully, started rebuilding something that looked less like a family and more like people who'd survived a war together. The betrayal took years to process, required professional help I'm still getting, but at least now we were dealing with reality instead of the carefully curated fiction we'd all been living. Derek's wife divorced him 6 months into his sentence, took their kids and moved 3 states away to start fresh where nobody knew their last name or their shame. I bought their house at auction, not out of revenge but because it was a good investment property, and I refused to let sentiment override good business. And turning his former palace into a rental felt like reclaiming something I couldn't quite name. The business recovered slowly, with new management, new systems, new oversight that made embezzlement nearly impossible, and Grandpa Joe finally retired at 85, knowing he'd fixed what he could before leaving. I expanded my rental portfolio to 7 properties, started a property management company, built the success I'd always been capable of without anyone's permission or approval. Dignity and self-worth, I learned, aren't given by family. They're claimed despite family, built in the spaces where you stop waiting for validation and start creating your own value. 3 years later, Derek got paroled early for good behavior and genuine participation in therapy programs that finally, actually addressed his issues. He reached out asking to meet, and after 6 months of my own therapy to prepare, I agreed to coffee at a neutral location where I could leave whenever I wanted. He was different, quieter, humbler, working as a bookkeeper at a nonprofit and living in a studio apartment that cost less than his old car payment. I can't undo what I did, he said, hands wrapped around his coffee cup like it was anchoring him to reality. I can't give you back your childhood or erase the trauma or make our parents' choices disappear. But I'm working every day to be someone who wouldn't make those choices now. Someone who understands that love without responsibility isn't love at all. It's just permission to destroy. We weren't close, probably never would be, but there was honesty between us finally, and that felt like its own kind of justice. Karma had taken everything from him, and was slowly, carefully offering back pieces of a life that looked nothing like the golden child fantasy. And watching him accept that with grace was the revenge I never knew I needed, the kind that comes from seeing someone actually change. So tell me, have you ever been the invisible child in a family that had a golden one? Have you watched someone get away with betrayal after betrayal because the people who were supposed to protect you chose image over truth, comfort over justice? Drop a comment below and let me know. What would you have done in my situation when you discovered your own parents had recordings of your brother plotting to frame you and said nothing? Would you have forgiven them, cut them off completely, or taken the path I did, demanding accountability while leaving space for genuine change? I want to hear your stories, your rage, your moments when you finally said, enough, and reclaimed your dignity from people who never valued it. Have you ever caught someone in a lie so big it redefined your entire relationship with them? What does justice look like to you when the legal system can only address the crime, but not the decades of emotional damage that led there? Share your truth in the comments. This community exists because we refuse to stay silent about family dysfunction disguised as love, because we know that real healing starts when we stop protecting people from the consequences of their own choices. And if this story resonated with you, if you felt seen in the shadows of someone else's spotlight, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because I'm bringing you more stories that expose the uncomfortable truths about family, betrayal, and what it really takes to build self-worth when the people who should have given it to you handed it to someone else instead. Let's keep this conversation going. Your voice matters, your experience matters, and somebody out there needs to hear that they're not alone in this.